Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Dave Harvey, I'm Executive Director of Park People. I'm the Executive and Founder. And today we're launching the third annual Canadian City Parks Report through this exclusive funder and key partner events. The people and organizations on this webinar are many of our key supporters, and we just wouldn't be able to do our work to improve parks communities without you. This invite-only event is just a very small way to say thank you for all that you do to support Park People. It just means so much to us. Thanks so much. And today we're going to be hearing a short presentation of the key findings, top stories, and insights from this year's report from our three report authors, followed by a discussion and opportunity for you to ask questions. We encourage you to post any questions you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen here. Use the chat function to say hello, talk to each other. But again, it's a very small, intimate group that we've pulled together here in this invite-only event. And so we're really hoping we can create a good dialogue and discussion about some of the important park issues that the report's uncovering. And at Park People, our work focuses on helping people to activate the power of parks to improve quality of life in cities right across Canada. But wow, what a year it's been, and an absolutely vital role parks have played to support physical and mental health. The findings reports are so critical and timely. It came out last week. This is sort of the official public launch, talk about it today, but there's already been great media coverage right across the country, newspapers, radio, and already 10,000 page views of the report as well. And in the context of today's discussion, it just feels so especially important to recognize the legacy of Indigenous displacement that has led to the creation of many urban parks and public spaces, and the historical role of urban planning in settler colonialism and dispossession. And in this conversation and in our work, it is our responsibility to guide and implement practices and policies that uphold and restore Indigenous relationships to the land. I would like to open today's webinar by acknowledging that the land we are all gathered on and expressing our gratitude for its critical connection to the health of us all. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, which is also home to Park People's head office. And Park People acknowledges that the land we call home sits on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce Emma Adamo, the chair of the Weston Family Foundation. The Weston Family Foundation has been a key supporter of Park People's work from our very, very earliest days. They provide founding key leadership support for the Canadian City Parks Report, and we just wouldn't be able to do this vital work without them. Emma Adamo is the director of the Weston Family Foundation and is the granddaughter of its founders, Garfield Weston and Rita Howard Weston. She became the chair of the foundation in May, just a little while ago, after serving as deputy chair for 2 years. Emma, thank you so much for your ongoing support.
Dave, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here representing my family's foundation to help launch the 2021 Canadian City Parks Report. Our foundation has been supporting Parks People for nearly a decade, helping them to play a leadership role in realizing the power of parks to build strong communities, healthy environments, and resilient cities. 4 years ago, our foundation met with Park People to discuss an information gap in knowledge about city parks in Canada. At that time, we supported Dave and his team to undergo a feasibility study for a report that would gather, analyze, and share data and stories about Canada's city park system. The following year, we enthusiastically supported the launch of the first ever report about Canadian city parks. And incredibly, 23 cities signed up on that first year, far more than Park People had anticipated. Since that time, the annual Canadian City Parks Report has been a key resource for municipal staff and volunteers to fill this gap in knowledge, share best practice, and respond to changing demands in city parks. This year's Canadian City Parks Report provides an in-depth look at how parks can help build robust and resilient cities, especially in times of crisis. In just 3 years, Park People has attracted 32 municipalities across Canada to take the time to share their stories, their data, and their plans for the future. To inform the report, Park People also conducted an online survey garnering nearly 3,500 responses. Canadians clearly have a lot to say about their city parks. The results of the survey show the undeniable benefits of park environments for the physical and mental well-being of community members. Our foundation is truly delighted to support park people to publish the Canadian City Parks Report. We believe wholeheartedly in its value and influence in parks management, planning, and policy. I encourage other funders to support park people and help the team continue to create this invaluable tool to improve city parks across the country for the well-being of all Canadians. Thank you.
And thank you, Emma, for those thoughtful words. And again, so much big thanks for all your critical support for the Canadian City Parks Report. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce the panelists who are going to be taking us through the report. We're joined by three amazing people, Jake Tobin Garrett, Adri Stark, and Naomi Amberber. I'm just going to introduce each one very quickly. I don't know where they are on your screen around there, but Jake is Park People's Manager of Policy and Planning. He's been here for nearly 8 years at Park People. Jake has co-authored multiple research reports, including all 3 years of the Canadian City Parks Report, as well as major studies into the social life of parks, public space governance, and inclusive engagement strategies. And then over there, or up there, is Adri, who's our project manager at Park People, who's also, she's been affiliated now with like 5 years, we can't believe it. And her work focuses on research and policy as well. She's also co-authored all 3 years of the Canadian City Parks Report and contributed to research exploring belonging in public space and the social impacts of parks in underserviced neighborhoods. And the last panelist is Naomi, and a wonderful new contributor this year. She's a Black public health researcher who writes about the social and national environments that foster people's well-being. She strives to bring her passion to all projects she works in, which have included those with the Wellesley Institute and the Center for Active Transportation. And just wanted to know, these are three of the smartest people in city parks in Canada, probably North America. I'm just constantly amazed by their insights, knowledge, and we're so lucky to have their expertise helping us out on Park People. And they're going to be taking you through the report for the next 20, 25 minutes or so. Over to Jake.
Thank you so much, Dave, for all those kind words, and to Emma as well. And thank you all for coming. I see some names that I know, like Doug Bennett and Eddie Greenberg and stuff. So just thanks so much for taking the time to join us. So for those of you who don't know, the Canadian City Parks Report tracks the trends, challenges, and opportunities facing Canadian city parks. And this is our 3rd year of the report, hard to believe. And our goal really is to share Canadian best practices, to establish a common set of data, and to inspire action. And we really try to present the data and the stories so they're accessible and interesting for everyone, whether you're a park professional, whether you're city staff, or whether you're like just a resident who's really interested in city parks. As Emma mentioned, we have 32 cities in the report this year, which is amazing. We get data and policies and practices from those cities, from Victoria, BC, all the way to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, so really coast to coast. We did a public survey again this year. Nearly 3,500 people, as Emma mentioned, responded to that, looking at their park use during COVID from April of 2021. And we did over 40 interviews with experts from different places in the country, including community members, city staff, academics, activists, nonprofit organizations. So just a big thanks to all those people. Doug is on the call today, and I interviewed him for 2 of my stories. So just thank you so much to all those who took the time. And as Dave also did already, but I would like to, thanks to the Weston Foundation. They funded this year of the report, but they've also funded all 3 years and are the founding sponsors of this report. And we quite literally wouldn't be able to do this report without them. So just a huge thank you to the foundation. Also, thank you to RBC Foundation. I think there might be someone from RBC on the call today. So this is the 2nd year that the foundation has supported the report in the nature section. So if you haven't this year, check out the nature section. There's some amazing stories in there around climate change that RBC has supported. So thank you to them for that. And also thank you to Maglan Site Furniture and the Toronto Foundation. I think there's someone from Maglan also on the call today, so thank you. They've both supported stories in the activation section on local economic development and community resilience in parks. And also thank you to an anonymous donor. Always want to thank the anonymous donor. So thank you to them as well. So if anybody's taken the time already to look, you'll know that this is a giant report. Even if you download the key findings document, there's a lot there. And so we're not going to get into everything. We're going to give an overview of the key findings, and we're going to give some stats and some of the examples, and then have a bit of a discussion afterwards. So first step, something that I don't think will be very surprising as a finding to most people, but parks showed high use and high value in the last year. Again, it's not surprising. I think all of us have experienced this in our different cities, going to the park and finding it just packed with people. As indoor locations were closed, we saw people really rely on parks more. Parks became our gyms. They became our co-working spaces, maybe our restaurant patios. If you were taking dinner out to the park or even getting pizza delivered to the park, I saw people do that. Our living rooms, where we socialize with friends and family. And for many people, parks became safe homes as well during the pandemic. And we saw this in the data that we collected. So 94% of the cities that we surveyed reported an increased use in parks. And so what we were interested in is seeing whether that might be a long-term trend. And our survey data from Canadians points to the fact that, yes, this is something that looks like it's going to be sticking around after the pandemic. So 2/3 of Canadians said that their park use increased during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. And 82% of those people said that they expect that use to continue and even increase post-pandemic when everything's back to the way it was. And the winter, the same. So 50% of Canadians said that they had increased their use of parks in the winter time compared to pre-pandemic. And 3/4 of those said that their increase will likely continue or even increase. And yes, Doug, that is Riverdale Park. I took that photo just a couple of weeks ago on a visit there. So some of the impacts I think are, obviously increased needs around maintenance for cities that will put pressure on already tight operating budgets, but also new amenities and programs that are needed, like all-season washroom access. This was something that I think was sorely needed before the pandemic, but it's just highlighted, how critical that is during the pandemic when indoor locations were closed and in the winter especially. One area in particular that we may see an increase is around stewardship and volunteering. So we did see volunteer numbers drop compared to last year on average across cities. It dropped from just under 12 volunteers per 1,000 to just under 3 volunteers per 1,000 on average. So that's quite a big difference. That was obviously due to restrictions during the pandemic on maybe how many people could participate. Maybe some volunteer programs were canceled. And people were obviously also maybe not volunteering as much as they would have for personal health reasons. But we see in the data that this is actually likely to rebound post-pandemic and maybe even increase. So nearly 60% of Canadians said that they're more interested in volunteering due to the pandemic. So I think the takeaway really from this is that the high use is likely to continue after the pandemic and also spur more interest in volunteering. So cities and nonprofit agencies and organizations that maybe work in this space might want to think about additional resources for stewardship, for volunteer engagement to take advantage of this interest. And just as an example, only 50% of cities that we surveyed this year had a Park Friends Group program in place. This is a program that residents can, where they can create community groups to kind of participate more in parks. So that might be an area that cities might want to look at increasing to help people kind of have avenues into volunteer opportunities. And I'll just hand it over to Adri for the next insight.
Thanks, Jake. So yeah, we found not only are people using parks more, but also using parks differently. So 89% of Canadians that we surveyed said that they had actually tried a new activity in parks during the pandemic. And this often involved taking traditionally indoor activities outdoors, as Jake mentioned. Some of the most popular ones were eating and picnicking in parks or socializing with friends and family. And cities responded to this interest in new uses with 84% implementing new COVID-related pilots, such as temporary washrooms, one-way trails to help support physical distancing, and also keeping seasonal facilities like tennis courts open into the winter to, again, just support people getting outdoors in the colder weather. And we saw some really creative projects across the country as well. So Edmonton, for example, launched 29 new pop-up community gardens across the city to address food insecurity, which we know was sort of a big challenge in many communities during the pandemic. And Calgary added free bookable fire pits to parks, which were super popular and saw over 2,000 bookings this past winter. Some municipalities also created new community grant programs to help support social connection. So as one example, Waterloo created new pandemic mini grants that sort of supported small-scale resident-led initiatives to bring together local communities. And Regina implemented a new $25,000 granting program specifically for outdoor winter activities that help sort of address social isolation, which we know, again, was a major challenge during the pandemic. And what we found through interviews with city staff who were sort of leading the charge on implementing some of these pilots is that the cities that were able to respond most effectively were often the ones that already had sort of established, well-staffed and well-resourced park programs in place. So just as one example, the city of Kitchener has an incredible natural areas program that offers sort of nature education and stewardship programming to residents of Kitchener. And because they already sort of had that in place, they were able to just adapt it to meet emerging mental health needs and create some wellness focused programming like mindfulness walks and forest bathing. Similarly, Quebec City has sort of a long-standing ephemeral places program that provides pop-up public spaces across the city that are either designed by community organizations who submit proposals or created by the city itself. And they were able to double the number of sites that they implemented these pop-up ephemeral places in across the city this year to 50 sites across the city. But at the same time as cities were tasked with responding to these pressures and new uses, we also heard very clearly through our survey that budgets were hit. So 60% of cities said that COVID had negatively impacted parks' operating budgets. And this is a real challenge, especially because our survey found that now that people's eyes have sort of been open to all of these new and different uses for parks, Canadians are looking for more out of their parks long term. So the top 3 measures that survey respondents said that they'd most like to see made permanent include winterized washrooms, outdoor cafes, and outdoor arts and culture events. But of course, these things take resources to make a reality. So I guess the good news on that front is that our survey also found that Canadians want to see their parks well funded to help support some of these changes. So 85% of Canadians said that they would like to see more public funding for parks. And I think this sort of reflects the new sort of appreciation for parks and rediscovery of the value of local green spaces that many people have experienced during the pandemic. Another finding that we focus on in the report is just how the pandemic highlighted the critical role that parks play in public health. So 60% of the cities that we surveyed said that COVID had increased their focus on planning parks for public health. And 89% of those cities expected that this would be a long-term trend or a long-term shift in how they sort of think about planning parks. And we also heard that the pandemic had catalyzed new partnerships. So for example, 84% of cities reported increased collaboration between parks and other departments during the pandemic, including public health. And then similar findings through our public survey. So 85% of Canadians said that parks had had a positive impact on their mental health during the pandemic, 81% on their physical health, and 71% on their social well-being. But a really important finding is that we also learned that the health benefits of parks are not evenly distributed. So for example, when we take a closer look at that mental health stat, 88% of Canadians who identified as white said that parks had a positive impact on their mental health, but this number was actually 16% lower for respondents who identified as Indigenous and 19% lower for those who identified as Black. So these point to some significant and sort of troubling gaps that highlight that not everyone has been benefiting from parks in the same way. And in the report, we really dig into this issue by exploring the idea of social access to parks and how that sort of mediates health benefits. So thinking not just about walking distance to the nearest park, but also focusing more on what's in the park when you get there. So Like, does it make you feel safe or comfortable? Does it have culturally appropriate amenities? Do you feel yourself reflected there? We found that these experiential dimensions of park access don't necessarily get as much attention, but they have deep implications for people's ability to sort of benefit from parks. So I wanted to highlight a few examples of how some cities are starting to address this. We can look at Brampton's new Uptown framework, which includes a focus on nighttime activation in recognition that many residents of Brampton are actually shift workers who might not use parks at the same time as the sort of 9 to 5 crowd and still need it to feel safe when they're out in their green spaces at nighttime. We can also look at Toronto, which has a cricket strategy in development, and cities like Surrey, which is planning new kabaddi facilities. And kabaddi is a contact sport that's popular in some South Asian countries. And then one last example is just Mississauga has a new park that provides a space for scattering ashes in Etobicoke Creek, which is a sacred ritual in Hindu and Sikh cultures that's often prohibited in parks. So creating space for this practice of course, has profound impacts for spiritual well-being, but some of these examples might be a little bit sort of outside the realm of what we might typically think of when we think of parks and public health.
Okay, so I'm really excited to be talking about some findings and some stories that speak to one of the central themes in this report, which is about ideas of equity, diversity, inclusion, which I know a lot of people have been grappling with for a long time, or maybe are just starting to grapple with it. In essence, however, these ideas really are talking about justice, and they ask a lot of big questions. So what would it look like to make parks a more just space? And how can we set an example in parks about how we exist and connect with each other on all of these lands? And so one thing before I just talk about these findings, I just want to contextualize that these are not new findings necessarily. We talk about them in this report, but I just want to emphasize how they're just more newly recognized. So a lot of communities have been telling us these specific facts over and over and have been really generously retelling these stories. And whether it's in reference to residential schools or the rise of Islamophobia, we are now just starting to recognize the truth in these. So the first finding is that parks are not accessible to everyone, just as Aju was mentioning before, and that access to parks doesn't necessarily mean you will feel safe in them. So Canadians who identified as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or BIPOC for short, were more likely to report experiencing barriers to park use during the pandemic, and 22% reported a fear of harassment. And as we're starting to accept this truth more widely, we saw this really reflected in the survey that we conducted. So 77% of Canadians agree that aspect of someone's identity, like race, gender, or age, affect how they experience parks. The second finding is that a just future for parks and all lands across Canada require collective stewardship. Again, this is something that Jake mentioned a little bit earlier, and we really wanted to emphasize in this section, and how BIPOC Canadians were more likely to cite an increased interest in stewardship activities in the survey. So that was 70% of BIPOC Canadians compared to 54% of white Canadians. Yeah, next slide, okay. So what the public survey and the city questionnaire really showed us is a reflection of the conversations that I mentioned, movement building, and the straight up work that communities have been doing. And the stories that reflect and supplement these findings are explored through interviews and research into projects across the country. So we spoke with Black, Indigenous, and other leaders of color, for example, on how the knowledge and expertise that they've built in envisioning this just future for parks has become more valued after a year of land defenders, Black Lives Matter rallies, and other cries for justice took over public spaces. So one of the people that we spoke to was Jacqueline L. Scotts, who some of you may have heard of or know personally, a PhD student at the University of Toronto who's exploring Black recreation, who reminds us that people of color are demanding change and that they're not going away anytime soon. We also spoke with people on what an Indigenous-led land stewardship would look like. So Eli Enns, the founder of the Ilsak Olam Foundation, shared to us a bit about the role of parks in displacing Indigenous communities and the importance of reconnecting with the land and every living being that occupies it. I just want to do a quick shout out to the image that you see on your screen, which is done by an awesome Indigenous artist named Holly Pachette, who really kind of like brought all of these amazing concepts into an art for us.
Thanks, Naomi. So, as we've been talking, obviously the year 2021 and 2020 have been the years of the pandemic. But we've also seen climate change as a real growing priority with cities. So 84% of cities said climate change and dealing with the impacts of extreme weather damage in parks was a growing challenge. And so that's high wind, droughts, fires, flooding. And this is something that's not likely, well, it will only get worse. Canada is warming, we know, at twice the rate of the rest of the world. And parks play a key role in mitigation for climate impacts. They help reduce temperatures, they manage rainfall and stormwater, and they help improve air quality. And I think we see the vital importance of this with recent heat waves in British Columbia and how these can be kind of life or death. One of the positive things I think around this is that more and more cities are implementing and improving climate change action plans and resilience plans. So 72% of cities this year reported having a plan like this in place, which is actually quite a jump from last year where it was 44%. And that's due both to new cities that have signed on to the report that had these in place, but also many new plans that have been approved in the last year or so with the declaration of the climate emergency. And these plans are driving really interesting actions. More use of electric equipment. So the city of Victoria has already shifted 20% of its fleet from gas to electric. Really important mapping initiatives to uncover areas with less green space, so less trees and parks that might be more prone to heat and have less access to the climate benefits of parks, and will allow cities to address gaps in equity gaps in terms of who has access to these spaces and really prioritize investment in many low-income areas. And we've seen a rise in increased naturalization also in areas and parks, and this sort of low-mow meadows is how it's termed to me from someone from the city of Vancouver. And this can really reduce the energy from mowing. You have to mow as often, but it also helps increase biodiversity and the cooling effects of parks. We know from studies that dense plantings like a naturalized meadow actually have a more beneficial cooling effect than mowed grass. And so we see, cities like Vancouver just instituted a pilot in many parks to naturalize some grassy areas. And cities like Edmonton also are kind of implementing this through changes in their park standards. We also profile a number of climate resilient park projects in the report. We found that Canadians were really supportive of these type of projects. So almost all Canadians, and 94% who responded to our survey, were supportive of more climate resilient infrastructure in parks. So rain gardens and trees. The image that you see on the screen is from Montreal. It's a plan to green a downtown street, McGill Avenue, introducing trees and water and planting beds and seating. And this will, obviously increase the biodiversity of this area, with the introduction of more green space and reducing pavement, but it also will help reduce urban temperatures in this area. And that last point is really important because, as I mentioned, heat can be deadly. In 2018, 66 people died in Montreal in a heat wave. When they looked at the data and where people had died, you were twice as likely to die if you lived in a neighborhood that was deemed an urban heat island. And these are areas with more pavement and fewer green spaces, and often fall in low income areas in many cities. So naturalizing streets and improving the climate resilience of parks can go a long way to unlocking the potential of green space to mitigate the impacts of climate change around heat and flooding. And it also creates new green spaces for people to enjoy, and also for wildlife as well. So it's really kind of a triple win there. Okay, so if we just go back, Just before we head on to the discussion, just really excited this year that we have a new training opportunity that we're launching that has grown out of the report. So this is a new half-day workshop that features the best practices and key insights from the report. And it's really geared towards park professionals and helping them tackle big issues and kind of think through creative solutions in their own cities and their own projects. So if you're interested in learning more about that, there's an email at the bottom there, but it's hireus@parkpeople.ca. And you can also go to our website and click on the services page and then scroll down to the Canadian City Parks Report workshops, and you can read a little bit more about them there. So thanks so much for listening so far. I'm interested for the discussion.
Yeah, and thanks to all three of you for obviously for the discussion today, and then the analysis you've given us, but also for writing an incredible report. We got a wonderful email this morning from an important person in the parks, an important parks professional who said the report's now a must-read for folks in this profession, and now you know why. So it's some incredible work, an awful lot there, and obviously they were just there's so much that's there, and if people haven't had a chance to look at the report, it's very easy to read. It's all online. You can go into different sections. You don't have to start at page 1 and end at page, how many pages? A lot?
Oh God, I don't know.
A lot.
Yeah,
but I was in 32 cities this year. So there's a lot of information there. But, the folks today on the panel were just hitting the key highlights. And I was informed by our tech people that, we can't see you, so we're not going to be able to do that sort of open dialogue thing that I was contemplating there. But if you have any questions or comments, throw the comments in the chat, into the Q&A. It can just be about anything to do with that, or that they talked about, or things that they haven't talked about that you might be interested in. I've got a few questions too that, as ED, I don't get enough time to dive into the report and to actually talk to these people as much as I'd like. But so I'm going to just start things off with a couple of questions for me. But please, folks, feel free to jump in on some of that. But I know, Jake and Adri, this is year 3 for a report for you. And Naomi, you're new in this year. But like, I'm going to throw this question out to anybody, like, what do you see as something like a key change from last year, or sort of a key trend or something that you've been seeing since last year?
I can start us off on this one, but I know that Jake and Naomi will have thoughts on this as well. But yeah, so I guess a key change with this year's report is that we really centered equity, as the sort of report title suggests, recognizing that on one hand, we've seen in the past year, parks have been sort of appreciated and celebrated like never before, as we've sort of talked about. But on the other hand, we know that across the board, COVID has sort of deepened and drawn new attention to existing inequities. So those of you who are familiar with the report will know that it has 5 sections. So we have nature, growth, collaboration, activation, and inclusion. And in previous years of the report, we had done sort of deep dives on different equity-focused topics in the inclusion section. So for example, in 2019, we looked really closely at truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and how that plays out in parks. And then last year in 2020, we focused on inclusive approaches to homelessness. And this year, of course, Naomi did her brilliant series on BIPOC leadership and stewardship in parks in that inclusion section. But we also wanted to make sure that we were bringing that equity lens to the other 4 sections of the report as well. So just as a quick example of what this looked like, for the growth section this year, which is the section that really looks at park planning and how parks are keeping up with population growth, we wrote the series that I mentioned about planning parks for public health. And there's a lot of literature on how to design parks for public health that sort of recommends things like ensuring parks are within walking distance, or that they have sort of walking loops to support physical activity once you get to them, or biodiverse natural spaces, because the research shows that there's a link between biodiversity and mental health. These are sort of the typical recommendations when it comes to designing parks for public health. But as Naomi and I sort of mentioned in the earlier presentation, there's also this whole experiential layer around feelings of safety and comfort in parks that doesn't necessarily have as much to do with the built environment. So just as one example, I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Janelle Joseph, who is a professor at U of T, about her research with Brazilian martial artists who often practice in parks, and their sport incorporates elements of martial arts, but also elements of dance and music and performance. And she said that many of the participants in her research, who were primarily Black men, had said that they had been stopped by police while practicing, this martial art in parks. And I thought that was just a really powerful example of how we also need to be paying attention to sort of what's socially acceptable in parks and sort of the informal and formal social rules that govern our public spaces. So yeah, that's just one example of how having that equity lens really benefited other areas of the report as well. And I think it sort of marks a necessary shift in how we'll approach the report moving forward. But Jake and Naomi, please add your thoughts as well.
Ooh,
Naomi, go ahead. We are muted at the same time. It was like a drop.
I guess so just to maybe follow up on what Adri said. Thanks, Adri, for saying that so eloquently. The other thing that I would say in terms of like the flip side is also about how, in my research of seeing how communities, specifically racialized communities, but also low income and disabled communities, are connecting the ways that they animate parks with these bigger social issues that I don't think people necessarily consider. The way that people use community gardens as a means to address food insecurity, but also to address climate change, of how localizing food production is also a real climate change mitigation effort. And so I think just as professionals and people who work in this kind of park space are putting those themes of equity into all of the work that they do, I think communities are also recognizing how powerful the language that we use around like connecting their efforts can be used to also strengthen their initiatives. And then Jake, I'll pass it to you.
I don't know if I have too much more to add there, but I think one of the things to me that has been such a difference between last year and this year is just a kind of explosion in conversation about parks. Just having so many more people talking about issues in parks and bringing up their own viewpoints. People I think that weren't in this conversation necessarily before, or were in this conversation and maybe weren't being listened to. And I think the pandemic really highlighted, it sort of magnified both the things that were good about parks and the things that we have challenges in. And those things were there before, but I think had been magnified. The importance of mental health, obviously, and social connection, but also the inequitable access for many communities, and the differences in enforcement of bylaws. I think about the Civil Liberties Association's report last year that showed that Black and Indigenous and people of color were much more likely to be subject to social distancing bylaw fines in parks in Canada. And also, just also the conversation around the sort of more visible homelessness in parks. One of the big changes that we saw in cities this year with their in the survey was I think it was 90% of cities this year listed homelessness in parks as a challenge that they were dealing with, which is much higher than it was last year. And so, yeah, I think these challenges were already there. They were always there, but the pandemic has really kind of put a magnifying glass on many of them for us.
Yeah, these are complex issues. I know we've got a number of city park staff and park professionals on the webinar today, and it's asking a lot of our parks and a lot of our city park staff to manage these very, very complex issues and balance all these things within existing budgets at the same time. So, it's obviously speaks to the importance of parks, but all the stresses that are being put on parks. If I can flip that question around then, so speaking of city park staff, Doug Bennett from the city of Toronto, one of our great partners with Parks and Forestry Recreation. So you've talked about some of the challenges that you've seen as some of the emerging issues and differences in the last year. So if like sort of looking at, maybe it's just addressing those challenges, or maybe there's an opportunity there. So Doug's asking about, if there's a way to move the needle on just two issues or challenges. And I know you've talked broadly about some things, but maybe we can get into a little more specifics in this question. What would those two issues or opportunities or challenges would you be saying that that city park staff should be looking at, or we've got a number of funders on that call too. Maybe it's something that some funders should be looking at too. So, what are those challenges? But then flip side too is, are there some opportunities there to be thinking about? Big question, but.
Okay, I'll kick this off. Thank you, Doug, for that question. Yeah, it is a big question. It's always hard to narrow down priorities, of course. I think for me, on the city side, I'm really excited to see some of the equity-based planning tools that are being created and implemented in cities. Vancouver's initiative zones, which mapped areas of where there's a need for low barrier recreation with areas that are underserved in terms of tree canopy and sort of more prone to heat, and using that as a way to direct investments and where green space improvements can be made, as opposed to the way that we have, I think, normally done things for many years, which is based on development growth and population growth, which is of course an important metric, but also leaves out many areas of the city that has led to, I think, historic underinvestment in many places, and some of these disparities that we see in access to quality green space and climate change benefits. So I would encourage and hope that the spotlight that we put on some of these equity-based planning tools in one of the stories in the climate change section is something that more cities will adopt as a lens to prioritize investment, especially as budgets might be tight. And then just quickly as a second priority, and then I'll pass it over for both cities and also maybe funders as well, I think is when we're thinking about climate change resilience, I think it can be an overwhelming task. And we think about, just listening to a podcast where a New Yorker writer was talking about like geoengineering and blocking out the sun, and it was making me feel very anxious and also overwhelmed. But I think, there's so many smaller things that we can be doing in our parks. And just, from standardizing the implementation of rain gardens in parks to help contribute to stormwater management and reducing flooding, to tree planting programs in areas that are underserved, to the creation of shade structures in absence of trees in the meantime to create some relief for people in different areas. I think there's these smaller actions that we can take in parks that add up to huge benefits, and so those are the two areas that I would hope we focus on.
Drew, Naomi, you don't have if you've got something. Okay. You good?
Oh no, AJ, I didn't know if we were going to unmute at the same time, like Jake and I did, or if that was
No, you go ahead.
Naomi, on to Naomi.
So sorry about that. Yeah, I guess my initial thought is, and I really want to echo what Jake said about these kind of like innovative tools that merge equity and climate change, and I see these two things as one and the same. But I guess I would also just really stress about having city staff or funders be really flexible to each really localized community's needs. I think it's hard to make pretty blanket statements at times because the needs of each community are so different, and they understand those needs pretty well. So I think one of the things that I would say in terms of moving the needle is really deep engagement early on in co-creation, because I think that will lead any park professional to the right answers for that area and for those communities.
Just to add on to what Naomi said, I was going to make a very similar point, and maybe just as an example, during the pandemic, I mean, I'm a little bit biased because I'm going to talk about a Park People program, but we had a community, something we called the Community Resilience Program, where community animators from 5 different underserved neighborhoods in Toronto were hired to sort of put on park programming that was locally responsive and really meeting the needs of their community. And the activities that they chose to do were so different, but so impactful because they're, you know, in touch with what the on the ground needs are. And so I think a lot, like in sort of resilience planning moving forward, like how can cities build those relationships with champions in different underserved neighborhoods so that it's easy to sort of flow resources to those areas when you know, there's another sort of event like this, or even when there's not, because yeah, people living in underserved communities know what to do. They just sort of need the relationships and need the resources. So I guess that's an area that I would choose to focus on.
Well, and it's something that we've talked a lot about at Park People too, about the flexibility and opportunity and quick responsive programming that, you know, we ask a lot of our parks in terms of capital expenditures and the need to be maintaining and building new parks. And that's obviously incredibly vital, but particularly when, you know, when these kind of unexpected events like COVID pop along, quick response things around programming. Or again, we've seen other, you know, Toronto, many cities right across Canada, very quick reactions, some creativity, opening to some more flexibility around COVID, a lot of experimenting with new ideas, using streets for public spaces, a whole bunch of things. So some quick responses to that. So speaking of more of some of that, like more, I think Jake used the word anxious and overwhelmed, but it wasn't necessarily specific, but directed at a park. But what, you know, so like what really inspired you? Like, is there one story or one person or one park project you went like, wow, that's cool. Like that's some really neat stuff. What's your big one? We'll go around. Jake's always going first. So Naomi.
I was hoping you wouldn't say that. No, but it's good to take Jake off the spot. So the one program, yeah, that's so tough. One thing that like I will just highlight, and it's a bit in the report, and the reason why I want to highlight it is because I see a lot of elements that can be used across cities. I had an interview with Carmen Rosen, who is the director of the Still Moon Art Society, a white woman living in Vancouver, who built up this group to really animate the spaces in and around her neighborhood and really bring community in. And one of the programs that kind of built off of the Still Moon Art Society is an Indigenous-led program uncovering history that is actually through the city of Vancouver's Fieldhouse program. So already we can see these like types of partnerships that are made. The city having this Fieldhouse program that can use the space, the different resources that the Still Moon Art Society has been making over time, but then those relationships with their those long-term relationships that they've made with Indigenous peoples in their communities to put on this type of initiative. So that was one that I thought really stood out to me, of how municipalities, white or non-Indigenous communities and Indigenous communities can come together to do some really amazing land stewardship programming. So that's the program that I would highlight.
Adri?
Sure. Something that I found really cool is just there's one piece in the report where we sort of explore this pilot project to permanent transition that a lot of cities are navigating right now with the new sort of programs that they've introduced during COVID. And one thing that I found really cool is that the city of Vancouver implemented a slow streets program, as did many other cities, to sort of pedestrianize some areas during the pandemic. And some of the momentum around that actually led to council directing staff to explore permanently reallocating 11% of their street space to people-friendly public spaces. So to me, that's just sort of a wild example of how some of these temporary initiatives we've seen pop up during COVID are actually sort of carrying forward positive change into the future.
I love that. That's so great. We don't think of our streets as like a public space resource, but in many cities, it's 25% of the land area, whereas parks are, much less than that. Sometimes, less than half usually. I think the thing that always sticks out to me and is a quote from this man I interviewed, Travis Canadian, who works with, is a community member of the Bell Island Caretaker Circle in Kingston, which is a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks who help care for and steward that sacred site of Bell Island in Kingston. And so he was talking about the work that they've done to clean up that island and the long process it has taken. And when I asked him for advice, what advice he would give to other groups and organizations who are doing this type of work, his response was to embrace your inner tortoise. And that has really stuck with me. It really shows that kind of good work takes time, especially when we're working through bureaucratic city processes. And I just thought about it often in the last little while as kind of a reminder to like slow down and to maybe question our assumptions and not rush critical processes. And so, yeah, like that's something that has really stuck in my mind from Travis.
Well, and again, that's and obviously I love parks. I love to be researching in parks. I love to be working there with you guys. Sometimes it's hard when I've got all that other ED stuff I have to do sometimes. But thinking about the work that you've been doing, and for Adrian and Jake, it's been 3 years, the City Park Report. I know it's hard sometimes doing some research and that the field and what we're asking of parks and how the parks world is changing so rapidly. Is there some area that, in the next few years, as we're thinking about, the City Parks Report for next year and other years, that you'd like, wow, I'd really like to do a deeper dive into that area? Or how can we work with other partners or research folks or, funders to here's an opportunity or something that we could really do some deeper research into and look at some of those issues or opportunities, things like that. Any thoughts on that?
I can go first to save Jake, but one of the things that I've been thinking about that's sort of related to Jake's point around wanting to see like more equity tools embedded in policies is just like a research project that I feel would be very helpful for municipalities and that I personally would be very interested in is just trying to make some of this stuff around embedding an equity lens in policy more tangible, like actually researching, okay, if you want to move from just a straight up environmental lens on your parks master plan to an environmental justice lens, like what are some indicators that you should be tracking? What are some targets that you should write into your policy? I think that type of work would be helpful in just making some of this stuff just more tangible for people. That's my thought.
Yeah, I mean, mine is quite similar. Like when I was doing when I was researching the climate change section, I read I read a lot of climate change action plans from cities, lots, and city park master plans. And along with Steph Stanoff on our team, we were looking for how those plans addressed issues of equity. And it was really interesting that we found that equity was often included as a principle and used as kind of in some of the language up front in framing the plan. But when you got down into the policies and actions of those plans, there weren't a lot of equity focused actions or policies or any kind of framework for measuring that or following through on that. And so it does seem to me like there's a desire on the part of city staff, obviously, to embed an equity lens in their work and to think through that, but that there does seem to be a bit of a gap, as Adrian mentioned, on how, God, I'm going to use a car metaphor, but when the rubber hits the road, what does that actually look like? I don't know why I use that metaphor. It's like me using a sports metaphor. Anyway, so yeah, I think that that's such an important area. And so like for me, I was really, I loved working on the climate change section this year with Steph, who did some of the interviews and learning about the intersection of parks and climate justice, and just reading about all of the work that has happened. Again, because I think climate change can be such a big issue. And so just thinking through how that might actually, translate into tangible projects that we can move forward in our cities and in our communities.
Any thoughts, Naomi?
Nope, not on this question. I think they've both articulated it
That's
amazingly.
good.
Yeah.
Great. Well, unless anyone else has a quick question or thought in the chat or the Q&A, I think we're going to sort of leave it there and sort of wrap things up. But what I would really encourage anybody who's on the webinar, this is our third year of the report. We're going to be doing another report next year. We're going to keep on going. This is one of the most important projects that Park People is involved in. It just gets better every year. Part of our process that we do working with the 32 municipalities is to do a lot of interaction back with them that, what did they learn from this year's report? What could be improved? How can we make this a better report all the time? If any of you have any thoughts on, like you should be looking at this, or you could be looking at that, or how could we partner better with this or fund this or, expand this, we'd love to hear your thoughts on how to keep on making this an incredibly important report. So again, really want to thank Emma Adamo from the Western Foundation for coming in and introducing this, and and all the work that's in support from the Western Foundation. Want to thank Jake, Naomi, and Adri for creating an incredible report. And most importantly, thank you for coming to the webinar. But again, you're part of our close Park People family, and we just appreciate all the support and the work we do all together to make our parks and communities the best they can be. So thanks for coming in, and we look forward to meeting you in person very soon in a park. Thanks.